And you noticed this at NYU when you started seeing this whole reaction and these trigger warnings and all this stuff that happened a few years ago, which you had never seen before. Can you describe kind of what you saw on the ground?
Yeah,
and,
sure.
and where are we at these days when it comes to universities? Because that wasn't there when I
was
in school.
So I teach at New York University's Stern School of Business. And I teach only MBA students, so I'm still teaching millennials. Gen Z will be coming in the next year or two. But beginning in 2014, weird stuff started happening. I saw some of it in my students at NYU, but a lot more was hearing stories from friends. And my friend Greg Lukianoff came to me in May of 2014 and said, John, weird stuff is happening on campuses around the country. Greg is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE it's called, and his organization stands up for students' free speech rights, almost always against administrators and deans who say, we need a speech code, oh, you can't tell jokes, oh, you can do free speech in that little corner over there, but not elsewhere. So Greg was always pushing back against administrators, and beginning in 2014, Greg began to see college students at some schools asking for protection from books, words, speakers, and ideas. So if a book is going to be signed that has difficult content or offensive content, you can't just assign it. You have to warn us so that we can brace for it and decide if we want to expose ourselves to it. And so that was what was called a trigger warning. Now these are not common, but they were popping up in many schools, requests for trigger warnings. Many more moves to ban speakers because they were ideologically dislikable, as opposed to saying, okay, a conservative speaker or even a progressive speaker who's Christine Lagarde, who was implicated in something, I suppose, I don't know. At any rate, when some students decided we don't want to hear from this, we want to no platform this person, they would often get their way, and invitations were rescinded. So lots of stuff started happening in 2014. Greg comes to me and says, John, the students are actually justifying this using the exact same cognitive distortions that I learned to stop doing when I learned CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for depression. So because I wrote The Happiness Hypothesis, I talked about CBT, Greg came to talk to me. I said, oh my God, Greg, this is brilliant. Wow, this explains it. Because I'd begun to see a little bit of this in my students. Now these are later millennials, not Gen Z, but this idea that if something is emotionally difficult in a book, it's going to be bad for the students who read it. Like, why? What do you mean? And I was reported to the dean twice for things that I said in my lectures that are just normal social psychology, like about the Milgram experiment and trying to explain how the Nazis did what they did. And there's just this greater sensitivity. I was reported to the dean for justifying the Nazis or something like that.
Really? What year was that?
That was 2014.
Okay, all right.
So it was just this new sensitivity, quickness to take offense, and especially linking it to a sense of fragility. That it's not just this is outrageous, this is dangerous. That's what was new. So we wrote up this article in late 2014 and early 2015. It came out in The Atlantic in August of 2015, titled The Coddling of the American Mind. And a lot of people said, oh, you're overreacting. Okay, yeah, there's like 7 anecdotes you're reporting. This is not a thing. Well, that was August 2015. Then comes Halloween. And at Halloween 2015, beginning at Yale, and I don't want to tell the whole story, but there were protests not over offensive costumes, because nobody wore one as far as I know, but over an email about offensive costumes and here's what you should wear and here's what you shouldn't. And so it blew up at Yale. It then spread to many other campuses. So basically October 2015 to January, February 2016 is the period of enormous unrest on campuses in which now a lot of norms are changed, a lot more requests for trigger warnings, safe spaces, bias response teams, that is, we need a way to report anyone who does a speech crime. And this has really chilled this. I don't want to talk about freedom of speech. What I want to talk about is how comfortable you feel talking openly and honestly versus feeling that you have to walk on eggshells and think about every word. Will I be reported for this word?
And did that continue, and is that the current state on campuses now around the world or in America?
So it continued growing for a while. That is, from Halloween 2015 through into 2016, this spread very, very quickly. Not to most universities, in that America has 4,300 institutions of higher ed. Most of them are not selective, not even residential, a lot of them, and it's not happening there. But at the elite schools, especially in the Northeast and the West Coast, from what I can tell when I travel around and it is happening at most of those schools. It's happening in the UK and Canada in very similar forms. It's not happening as much on the continent of Europe. There are hints of it, but it's not as much there. So it is spreading. It's spreading very quickly, especially in the English-speaking countries. And let's see. And then when 2016 is the election year in the United States, and when Donald Trump is elected, now passions are so high. The culture war in America, the polarization, the mutual hatred of left and right is a piece of the backstory here. And that really ramps up after Trump is elected. So in the spring of 2017 is when most of the violence occurs. That is, thank God there's been hardly any real violence, and nobody's been killed in these protests yet. But what violence there was at Berkeley, at Middlebury, at Evergreen State College, all of that happens in the few months after Trump is inaugurated. Since then, there's been less spectacular stuff, but at the same time, I would say the norms have changed, so that now we're all adjusting to the fact that there's a lot of things we can't talk about, and when we talk, we have to be very, very careful because things could blow up very quickly.
And so how does this affect democracy?
So, so first let's do how it affects teaching. I think it's important to focus institution by institution rather than just talking about society. Okay. So at universities, now that we have bias response teams, there's a way to anonymously report me if I say something that a student finds offensive. There's a poster in every bathroom telling them who to call. I've called the bias response team at NYU to try to find out, do I have a record? Have I been reported? I've called twice, they haven't returned my calls. I've emailed them. So I have no idea what's going on. And so a lot of us across the country make a similar calculation. I could teach something that's controversial, that some students might object to, but what will happen? I don't know. And now that many of us know people who've been prosecuted or brought up on charges for this sort of stuff, a lot of people make the decision, it's just not worth it. And I was talking to some cognitive psychologists a few months ago at a major university in the Midwest who said, we just don't teach intelligence anymore. In the basic introduction to cognitive psychology, where intelligence is almost always a day or a week in the curriculum, it's a major area of research, they just cut it. Because if we teach about intelligence, some students might report us.
Why intelligence?
Because of the findings about heritability, because intelligence, like almost every trait, is partly heritable, and then it's so sensitive I can't even really talk about it here.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So we're making people more fragile in a sense.
We have
or less educated.
I would say that in normal human life, a lot of good things happen, a lot of bad things happen. And if you feel a flash of negative emotion, that's just part of life. But I think we've taught many students that if you feel negative emotions from something someone said, it's not your issue to deal with, it's somebody else's problem. There's a way to report that person. And so, one of the principles in our book, one of the really bad ideas is always trust your feelings. And if your feelings are a reliable guide to what has happened, and the administration sort of validates that and says, if you feel insulted, offended, marginalized, then an offense has taken place and there will be a bureaucratic solution for it. So I think this is the change that's happened in universities. And then, okay, so that's universities. Then we can talk about what effect does it have on businesses, and we can talk about what effect does this have in democracy in general.
Yeah.
Which way do you want to go?